Hi, DW. Thank you for coming back here today.
Hi, Michelle. Pleased to be here.
So can you share a little bit about your latest book, Curriculum, Racism Awareness?
Yes, I was requested by the publisher of a large school district, which I really can't reveal at this time, but it's about 1 million students, asked me if I would write a book because they saw some of my other literature and asked if I would write a book about racism called Racism Awareness. And in the topic of racism awareness, we look at how best to address and combat racism. And so the book essentially is written for, this particular book is written for advanced placement, college-bound students, because it's pretty in-depth. But we do plan to write books now for all levels from K through 12. And the idea is to teach empathy as a way to overcome racism.
And I love how in your curriculum you provide questions that relate to the students' lives on how racism and empathy have affected them. And can you share some of the tips and tools on how to build empathy in children?
Sure. Empathy, of course, when you compare empathy to sympathy, it's really kind of a fine distinction. But sympathy is you're looking at something externally, and I'm sorry, sympathy, you're looking at something externally. You're looking at that person, feeling sorry for them. Empathy, you actually place yourself in that person's shoes. And you say, how would I feel if I were that person experiencing this? And it's a tool that is very, very effective. Actually, there was a movie back in 1996 called A Time to Kill. And Matthew McConaughey played in that movie. It was based on John Grisham's 1986 novel, I believe it was. And it was about a young Black girl named Tanya Haley who was abducted, raped, and then thrown off a bridge and left to die. Mm. And it's interesting because just a little thing to know about court, in California at least, you're not allowed to ask the jury to put yourself in the victim's shoes. It's not permitted.
How come?
Because it's such a powerful tool. It's so powerful. And Matthew McConaughey did that, but he did it in a way that would have passed muster. What he did, when he described in his closing argument what happened to this little girl and how she was raped and beaten, it's like 10 years old, thrown off a bridge and left to die. He described all that through detail, and all the jury's sitting there looking, and they said, now I'd like you to close your eyes. And then he just went through a little more, and then he said, now picture that little Black girl is a little white girl. And everyone just immediately opened their eyes and was shocked. You could just see the whole jury turned at that point. And it wasn't like he was saying, empathize and pretend that happened to your daughter or something like that. But he got as close to it as he could. Mm. And it's such a powerful tool because if a person learns to internalize something that they see, if they learn to internalize someone else's experiences as opposed to just looking at it from the outside, then it's much more profound. And so what we're advocating is teaching children to be empathetic very early on as a way of living. And in fact, again, like we talked about the last time we interviewed, every major religion in the world promotes this and says this is what you should be doing. You know, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, they all say the same thing. Empathy, they call it empathy. You know, and it's so powerful that this is the only thing I believe that will heal the racial conflict that we have in America today.
So is empathy something that we practice and we get better at? Is it something that we're born with? How, if every major religion promotes empathy, how come it's not already within us?
Because it is something that, well, you know, after our last interview, you and I talked briefly, you mentioned that in Psychology Today, they do believe empathy is you're born with it and you lose it, because even a baby will look at a parent, and if the parent's upset and crying, the baby will start crying. Mm-hmm. So is the baby experiencing empathy or sympathy, or, you know, it's hard to tell, but I'm inclined to think that there is something that the baby is so, his world is so limited, he almost can't avoid being empathetic at that point. But then as he grows older, becomes selfish, you know, he starts thinking of himself more, the empathy kind of fades away unless people are taught to be empathetic. And so what we'll do, we're going to take case studies, and some of them will be fictional, some of them will be true, like each chapter of the book that you've read begins with a story, and a lot of them are true. A couple of them are fictional, but they're designed to get the person to think, how would I feel if I was that person? What would be my response in that situation, and how would I feel? The one story, one of my favorite, is a little girl named Janet Bailey, who went to moved from Georgia to Michigan in 1963 and was the first Black student attending a white school. And her father got a job at Ford Motor Company, and they were living near River Rouge with one of the big plants. And she was ostracized. She was ridiculed. She was picked on at school. One of the girls that picked on her the most, she and her friends, her little sister died. Her second grade sister died. And she had a dream that this girl came to her in a dream and said, the way you feel right now is the way Janet feels all the time because you're so mean to her. And then she spread that story, and the whole community changed because they understood. That's what empathy does.
Yeah, as you're saying, you're able to heal. You're able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And those stories that are mostly true are so powerful. And I also like that you bring in the history of the courts and the laws in America and the laws in Europe as well. And that you bring in additional insight and knowledge that, I mean, I wasn't taught in school. You brought in the example of Lord, and I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Lord Mansfield.
Yes.
And how through his personal experience, he learned that his prior beliefs were not accurate. Can you share a little bit about that? I know that it's in the curriculum, but I thought it was I didn't learn about that in school.
It is such a great story. And actually, there's been a book about it, and now there's been a movie about it. A movie called Bell. I would encourage everybody to read it. Watch the movie. Dito Bell was the daughter of a man named John, who had a relationship with a Black woman in Africa. They had a child. He was a ship captain, Navy ship captain. And of course, he couldn't keep his daughter on the ship. Now, his father was a very famous judge, probably the leading judge in England at that time. And he was John was the nephew of Lord Mansfield. And he didn't know what to do with his daughter when her mother died. And so he asked them if they would take her in. They said, well, okay, she's our blood, we'll take her in. So then, of course, he brought her there. They found out for the first time when they arrived that she was a mixed race child. And their immediate reaction, they were horrified. What are we going to do? We can't have a mixed race child and say she's our blood and so on. So they raised her. But what happened was they became very close to her. And they found out that all the stereotypes they'd heard about Black people were false. She was a genius. She could play the piano like a concert pianist as a child. She was studying law. And by the time she was a teenager, she was an expert in the law. And they realized how wrong they had been. And so he handed down two very important decisions in England, that eventually led, I believe, to the outlaw of slavery, because he became empathetic to Africans because he had experienced it in his own home, in his own life. And then they realized how poorly they treated Dito Bell, that was her name, when she first arrived. They said they wouldn't let her eat with the family and all that when her guests were there. And they realized how wrong all that was. So then they started letting her eat with the guests, and all these aristocrats would come. They'd be shocked that there's a Black person, eating at the table with all these white people. But he was so powerful, nobody would criticize it for it, at least not to his face. There was a big groundswell in England. We need to get rid of this guy. He's gone crazy. But it's such a wonderful story. I love it. There's a movie called, I guess it's just called Bell, Belle, and it's based on the book Dito Bell, which I think everybody should watch that. It's just one of my favorite movies.
And also in your curriculum, you discuss the difference between systemic racism versus institutional discrimination.
Yes.
And, the whole curriculum is so powerful, but I think understanding the difference, and you also discuss how words can be really powerful. And in the mental health world, we talk about how the language that we use creates our reality.
Right.
So the power of the word, and really looking at, I know when I grew up, they'd say like, well, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt me. But we know that that's not true. Words do hurt, and words are really powerful. So Absolutely. Can you share a little bit about the difference of systemic racism versus institutional discrimination?
Okay. Well, traditionally, the term that was used was institutional discrimination, and that is the correct term to describe what we experience most of the time today. People need to understand what systemic means, and this was a term that was adopted by Joe Fagan just a few years ago. He's a professor at Texas A&M University, a sociologist, and he came up with the term systemic racism to describe what he believes we have in America. But you have to understand that systemic is a medical term. It's a medical term of art. Systemic means like your blood flow and your circulatory system. So what he's implying, which I believe is a very poor choice of words in my opinion, he's implying that, for example, in our police departments, there's like this massive racism. All the officers are part of it, and it's nationwide. And this is the view that came out of the 1920 event of George Floyd. And that simply isn't reality. That's just not true. I mean, you know, I work with police officers all the time. Yes, we do have racism, and it does occur, but that doesn't mean that we have this racism that just goes through every single person in the police department. That's where he went wrong, I believe, and I believe eventually that term will be put aside. Merriam-Webster didn't adopt it as a term until I think 2001. Mm-hmm. So it's a relatively recent term, but the difference between racism and discrimination, and you can look at the Harvard American Dictionary to understand that. Racism is a belief that certain people are inferior by virtue of their race. And just by that alone, you think they're inferior, they're superior, whatever. That is called racism. In contrast to that, you have discrimination. Discrimination is action that hurts people. It may not be a racist intent, but it may have those consequences. And an example, one of the examples I gave in my book is that the poverty rate among Black people today is about 19%, in contrast to white people, which is about half of that. And you say, okay, well, isn't that racism? It's past racism that carried forward to today in the form of this institutional discrimination. They are put in situations where they are because of disadvantages that they experienced previously, that their ancestors experienced. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they're disadvantaged in many, many ways today. And the thing that we need to do, what society needs to do, is help them overcome that disadvantage. Mm-hmm. And what we really have is, for the most part, is institutional discrimination, as opposed to systemic racism. I did tell one story about a young couple, Kayla and Raymond. They pronounce their name Sykes, but most people I know, they have that spelling, call it Sykes. But they were traveling through North Carolina in 2000, and they were stopped by the police in a small town. And their jackets were taken from them, their shoes were taken from them, their son was taken from them, placed in foster care for almost a month. And while they were there, they couldn't leave because they were afraid that they'd never see their son again. So they were trapped in this little town in North Carolina for that long. Well, it just turns out that they are media moguls, and they knew how to rally support. So they put word out everywhere, and thousands of people then rained down on this little town. What are you doing? And they were able to get their son out, go back to New Jersey where they live. But while they were there, they were told by one of the social workers in that town, if you get a chance to be alone with your son and you have a way out, you need to take him and run. What they do here, they kidnap, they take Black children from families, and they claim that the Black parents are incompetent, and they call it child neglect, and they take them and they put them in foster care, and then they place for adoption. Most of the families don't have the money to fight it. She said it's a common problem in this town. So I did a little search on this town, and I found out that this is the town where they still have KK rallies at the courthouse. So all of that, was true. And it was amazing to me that something like that could happen. Now, that is an example of modern day racism. And the strangest thing about it, one of the police officers who was involved in the original arrest was a Black man. So you say, no, wait a minute, why would he do that? Well, it's kind of like, in Europe, you had some of the Jewish people who would carry on tasks for the Nazis, and in exchange, they could live longer. And it's the same kind of thing. He sees a personal benefit of going along with the white establishment, and they like you for it. But so in other words, as long as you toe the line, you're fine. But if you get out of line, it's big trouble. But I would venture to say that is an extremely rare situation in America today. I don't believe you would find that very many places. I know you wouldn't find it here in California, at least no place I've ever seen. The closest thing I saw to it was a black man whose key was carded. And, not to say anything bad about Temecula, but it did happen right here, Temecula, over at Lowe's. His key, somebody took a key and scratched the side of his car. And I happened to walk up while he was looking. He goes, "Why would somebody do that?" And I didn't, mention anything about racism, but I believe that was probably the motivation. So you do have instances of racism, but it's not the systemic racism like Joe Fagan describes, in my belief.
And then you also discuss the difference between overt versus covert racism in your book as well, which I think is an important distinction to teach people, because it's not always going to be those very obvious examples, as you were mentioning, in that small town.
Yeah, sometimes people they exhibit racist behavior and they may not even realize what they're doing. They may not even realize that what they're saying, it's often based on stereotypes of people. And they will make a statement that will seem racist or will seem like they are, and maybe they've just never thought about it. It's not because they're intentionally being racist or simply dislike the group. They believe the stereotypes that they've learned, which are typically incorrect.
Well, and I have another quote from your book that I really like. Where is it? I thought I wrote it down, but I want to have this other example. It is only by learning about the mistakes of our history that we can avoid repeating those mistakes in the future, which is why I really like that you bring up mistakes that we've made and are teaching history. I think history, which in our last interview, is so important in learning from our past behavior. What have we done well and what have we not done well?
Right. And what we have done in the past, and this gets in the whole critical race theory argument, what the United States has done in the past is tried to downplay all the negativity, all the bad things that occurred. As a result, there have been things that have happened that are incorrectly reported or not reported at all. But we do need to be aware of what happened. And we do need to understand that was a different time. It was America, but it was not us today. And we've adopted thousands and thousands of laws to try to combat those situations. But we still need to be aware that it occurred. And so that's why I write the biographical novels about people who have suffered. For example, Not Without a Fight, the Jews in Poland, and another one coming out called Because I'm Black, which is about Jesse Washington, who was lynched for a crime he probably didn't even commit. We need to be aware that these things happen so that we know that we don't make those mistakes again. And part of what's happening right now in the United States is I'm seeing the ignorance. And I don't just mean among a few people. I mean, as a nation, we are very ignorant. Political leaders, everyone, very ignorant of these distinctions. And that's why they need to be made clear. That's why people need to understand them.
And I just read a book by, I think his name is Ian Leslie, on curiosity and how lots of times when we're ignorant, we're so ignorant that we don't even know that we're ignorant.
That's true.
That whole we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And through knowledge, that can also combat some of that ignorance. But unless people like you are writing this curriculum that teaches different perspectives and the different facts of what has happened, we don't even know.
Right. Much of what we have from our history is not correct. And much of what we have in our actual history is missing from our textbooks. It's really unfortunate, but I mean, I understand why that happens, but a couple of things need to happen. Number one, we need to face it. We need to admit it. And we shouldn't do it in a condemning way. And this is what this is why critical race theory is being fought so hard against, throughout the nation. I think 20 some states have, either pass laws to abolish it or prohibit it, or they're in the process of doing that, because it's very confrontational. It doesn't present itself in a way. And just let me step back a minute and make it clear. Critical race theory is merely a method of study where you look at things that we didn't look at before. So when I say critical race theory, people are opposed to it. Really, they're opposed to what they believe it is. It's much broader than that. It's much broader than simply people trying to disparage people today. It's actually anything that studies the aspect of racism in our history, which has been primarily ignored. And I think that we need to not ignore it, but we need to look at it, understanding things that have been done to address it. And that's why in my book I have two chapters on the laws that have been passed to address racism and what we should be doing going forward.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, is there anything else that you think the audience should know about racism awareness, your new curriculum, and also if people want this curriculum in their school district, how do they go about that?
It will be available. The publisher is actually it's written for this one large school district, but we plan to make it available throughout the nation. Amazon.com or whatever, and school district will be able to purchase it. Got a very low price. The goal is to make it available to people, not to make a whole lot of money off of it. So that's our objective. It's very important information that people need to be aware of, and that's why we're doing this. So it will be available everywhere.
Wonderful. Well, once you have that information, please send it to me so that I could put it in the description below. Anything else that you want to share with the audience today?
No, just want to say happy Juneteenth for everybody celebrating that today. So, which I guess is actually yesterday, but yes. So anyhow, no, I think that covers it.
Great. Well, thank you for being here today. And for those of you at home, if you have not subscribed to Mind and Body Pilates, A Wellness Approach, please do so by clicking on the logo below. Thank you.